I am so excited to announce that I have released the first official tarot diagnosis spread book. Tarot and Self-Discovery is a therapeutic tarot journey with over 200 spreads, including over 152 card prompts and over 50 robust tarot spreads. You can purchase a physical copy on Amazon or a digital copy at thetarotdiagnosis.com. You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. So in honor of spooky season, we're diving into a topic that feels particularly fitting for this time of year. We're going to be talking about horror movies and more specifically, their monsters as portraits of the psychic terrain. And what's even more exciting is I'm joined by one of my favorite spooky therapists and a fellow podcaster, Candis Green, who you might know from Mental Health is Horrifying. So hi, Candis.
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I seriously get so excited anytime you and I get to collaborate because I admire your brain and your energy and your creative spirit and just everything you're kind of doing in your neck of the woods. So I just love having you around. So I'm really grateful that you're here.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. And I just want to eat your brain too.
I love it. It's like cute aggression and also like intellectual aggression. Like, yes, I love what you're doing.
Zombie aggression.
Yes. So we all know that, horror films are meant to scare us, but I feel like we don't often stop to think why they scare us. Aside from them being, gory and maybe playing psychological mind games with us or just showing us creepy images. There's also a part of horror that I think mimics our internal world. And that's, I think, a lens that you look at horror through. And so I'm really excited to have an opportunity to explore horror and monsters and how they highlight or mirror kind of our internal world and help us tend to maybe even our shadow components. And maybe even help us rebalance a part of our psyche when we are feeling a little unstable, which you wouldn't necessarily think horror could do, but it can. So, and then you're also going to help us explore our monster soulmate, which I am super excited about. And because this is your specialty, horror and mental health, I would love for you to just kind of open the episode and talk to us about how can we combine all of this and how does horror and monsters reflect our kind of internal psychic terrain, the shadow, and maybe even the collective unconscious?
Yeah, so I really like what you were saying about how a lot of people are just naturally very put off by horror, or they want to kind of reject it as a whole, or people think that it's gross or disgusting or amoral or whatever it is. And it kind of makes sense that we do that because horror reflects our shadow parts. And the shadow is something that we reject. This is the parts of ourselves that we repress because they're either unacceptable to us or they're unacceptable to society, morals and values. So when we're seeing them on the screen in horror, kind of on full display, and sometimes even in a way that is sort of like celebrated, for a lot of people, that's just completely off-putting and it's too uncomfortable to look at. So, we say, I don't like horror. This is gross. I don't like it. But if we can kind of like get curious about like, what's going on here? What is this strong emotion that I'm having? What is this response? And what does that say about, maybe this horror character is representing something inside of me that I've repressed. Maybe they're carrying some emotional freight that I'm not able to carry myself. And if we can kind of like lean into that and appreciate horror as performing this sort of emotionally compensatory function, that's when it starts becoming really healing and really interesting.
I love that you used the words emotional freight too. I'm over here just like drooling. I'm like, yes, that's a really good way to describe that. And also you bringing in the component of the shadow, because our shadow is, yes, everything that you just said. And it tends to, I feel like, live really close to like our line of consciousness, and often is hooked or we're made aware of it in times or moments where we are maybe feeling threatened, or we're afraid, or we're having some sense of kind of emotional overwhelm or activation. And I think that's what happens to us when we're watching horror. And, whether we realize it or not, like you just said, these moments when we're having that emotional reaction, when maybe we are kind of getting close to that line of where our shadow is conscious versus unconscious, we are either on the precipice of confronting or actively confronting our shadow through this experience of horror and thinking about or experiencing monsters, which I just think is so cool. And then you brought up the concept of the kind of emotional compensatory function of horror, which you and I, when we did a podcast last year on Spooky Time, you kind of touched on this, which I think is so important, because horror allows us, and you speak to this so beautifully, and I really want you to talk more on it, allows us to engage with those uncomfortable feelings like anxiety or fear or disgust or shame, all those feelings that kind of like exist in our shadows, in a way that is controlled and safe. So I'd love for you to just speak to that a little bit more and how all of that plays in with horror and monsters.
Yeah, the emotionally compensatory piece is really big. Like, horror tells our darkest stories. It holds our deepest fears and emotions. It validates them, it reflects them. And when we see that on screen, it allows us to kind of recollect those parts of ourselves and reclaim them. It's what's called a transcendent function. It's like the unification of the self becomes possible because the shadow, which is this unconscious part, it meets our conscious awareness in the creation of a third thing, which is a monster or a horror movie. And as a really great example of this, so during COVID, you might have expected that media consumption through streaming platforms and watching movies and TV shows, that it would have all gone up. And it did. But more than any other genre, disproportionately, horror went up the most.
Wow.
And in particular, there was one movie that came out in 2011, Contagion. I think Matt Damon was in it. And it was about, a contagion, a bacteria, a virus. And during the depths of lockdown, I think it was March, this movie disproportionately kind of flew back up the charts, and people were just lapping it up. And you would think during that time, people were so anxious. People needed an escape from thinking about COVID, from thinking about getting sick. But people were actually turning towards a movie that validated and represented and expressed their fears as a way to kind of recollect that part of themselves, to soothe, validate that part of themselves. And so that's emotional compensation. And it's very interesting how horror can do that.
Yeah, and I'm thinking really any film, but definitely horror. And I think it speaks to the fact that this isn't just, or this type of entertainment doesn't have to just be, for lack of a better word, just entertainment. It can actually be pretty therapeutic, because we're giving ourselves space to explore something like Contagion during the height of the pandemic in a controlled, safe container, because we were all, in lockdown, confined to our homes. We couldn't, go outside. And so here we were being able to kind of have this outlet, emotional outlet, because, there was so much pent up with us. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that so many people flocked to that as a way to almost discharge what was in them. And that gave them a way to discharge it, in a way that was creative and also safe. And then I think also maybe helping people feel less alone and less isolated during a time that was really marked by actual isolation, because here's this film that was created that kind of mimics what's happening for people both internally and externally. So yeah, it's so fascinating that skyrocketed during the pandemic. But, it does make sense, especially when you're trying to balance, your internal heightened emotions with whatever's happening in your external world.
Yeah. And it's like in that movie, you could say it's like, oh, the virus is the monster or the villain,
right?
like that's the antagonist. And it's interesting to think about how, walk into any Spirit Halloween right now, and it's like monsters are so celebrated in these stores. We love them. We love Ghostface. We love Michael Myers. We love Jason Voorhees and, people like Jennifer Check. And you have to kind of ask yourself, like, why is that? Why are we celebrating them? And we love them. We're so into them. They're on our mugs and our t-shirts. And it's this thing where they are reflecting parts of ourselves, right? They're, maybe Jason Voorhees is expressing, this kind of rage that you feel inside at, being neglected or not being taken care of, or that piece about, emotional freight. We look at Ghostface mask, and it's not just a mask. Like, that mask is the specter of intergenerational trauma. It carries so much more weight than just, oh, this spooky, scary monster. It's like reflecting these very deep parts that we all have inside of us. And we love these monsters. They don't have to abide by society's rules. They can act out the things that we are not allowed to, that we necessarily don't want to, right? But they can act out these things that we cannot.
Oh, I'm just like swimming in everything you're saying right now. Yes, like yes, a million times. And the whole time we were talking, I'm even thinking like most recently, like Pearl and Maxine, like absolutely. Like we love these characters, even though we're technically like not supposed to, right? Because they're doing these just like heinous, horrible things, but it allows us to tend to the parts of ourselves that maybe we feel like we're not allowed to tend to. Like we do, of course, hopefully we're not these like horrific murderers, but there's like these underlying components that I think if we really take a moment to get deep and psychological and emotional, it's more than just the act that represents them. It's really what drives the act and what's going on. I think that's why people are obsessed with the Dahmer documentary, or not even the documentary, it was the series. And there was so much empathy, and there was a lot of discourse on that, with people saying, I can't believe so many people are, empathizing with this person. And I found that discourse really fascinating in and of itself, because you could identify him as like a real actual monster. This isn't a fictional monster. But it makes me wonder too, like, what are people seeing, in those folks? But to get back to the monster conversation, I do think that there are parts of ourselves that we are giving ourselves permission to celebrate. Like you said, when we walk into Spirit Halloween and we buy the mug, or we buy the purse, or buy a pearl dress, so, yeah, it's really fascinating to think about this type of entertainment as also being a reflection of our own internal world that we don't often give time or space to exist outside of like, a moment here or there. And the privacy of our own home.
Yeah. And I mean, like, who can't relate to Pearl, right? Like,
oh my God, right?
This girl who feels like she's been overlooked and, she's kind of put upon. She has to stay in this farm she doesn't want to be on.
Right.
She can't follow her dreams and she just screams out like, I'm a star. And she kind of loses it. And like, you kind of want to cheer for her. Like, you sort of like look around, make sure nobody is, judging you as you cheer for Pearl. But like you kind of cheer for her because you relate to her.
And that, like, what was it? That's like 10-minute monologue or something. It was like so powerful because it was in that moment where she was really advocating for herself too. Like she was like, I know what I am worth and I'm going to get it. But I think, from a shadow perspective, there's a lot of entitlement wrapped up with that particular, character. And I think when we're reflecting on our shadow, a lot of us want to be like, oh, entitled and selfish. And, that's the part of us that we want to repress. We don't want to be kind of in the spotlight, or we feel like that's wrong. We shouldn't want attention. We shouldn't, think so highly of ourselves. But she does think really highly of herself, and she does have this sense of an entitlement. And so for us to celebrate that, I think, for many of us, it's a part of the shadow being like, oh, okay, like, yeah, you go get that because I feel like I'm not allowed to be that way.
Yeah, it's so funny because Shannon, as soon as you started saying, oh, Pearl has this entitled part, I was like, Shannon, shut up. Like Pearl is allowed to just be extra and over the top in her little 2-hour feature because this is just like her shadow movie. But like, like that's the thing. It's like, you can't judge the shadow when you're giving it this safe container to explore it in horror. Like, can you just give 90 minutes? Right. Can you just give 2 hours for your shadow to just like play and don't judge it and don't say, oh, I should this or I shouldn't that. Just let it roam.
Yeah.
And then, your ego is going to do the work in the rest of your life to keep that in check, to kind of, put it back in its cage. Like it'll do that, but you can't deny this part of yourself. You can't deny your shadow. That's how, the psyche becomes imbalanced. That's how we develop complexes and anxiety and depression. So like allowing yourself this safe and accessible outlet to sort of cheer on Pearl or, for me, and, maybe we can talk about this, like my sort of monster soulmate that I love to cheer on is Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. Let yourself for your little 90 minutes, 2 hours and kind of, and then you put it back.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're describing is giving ourselves permission to have this, these repressed either desires or fantasies or just like overall energy allowed to exist, outside of us and externalize it in a way. And then I feel like by doing that, it gives us an opportunity to almost like reprocess and then reintegrate. If we're even from a therapeutic perspective, think about, treatments like EMDR or accelerated resolution therapy or just, trauma therapy in general. The whole point is to like reprocess. And so we're essentially doing that with the shadow. Like we're reprocessing shadow material in a creative way. And we all know like the research that exists on creativity for mental health and just treatment in general is overwhelming. So it would make sense that, we should be giving ourselves permission to just sit back. This is not real. We're not going out doing these terrible things. But there's a part of your psyche that's like, you know what? Let me exist in this space for a second. And then, you made a good point too. When we ignore the shadow or we don't allow ourselves to interact with those parts of ourselves, that's when it can control our behavior or show up in ways that is detrimental to our relationships, whether it's platonic, romantic, or professional. So even just acknowledging these different parts of ourselves through film can eventually help us show up in ways that are more, like you said, balanced and even just authentic, and help us feel less overcome with frustration and anger and anxiety.
100%. And so, like, I'm a trauma therapist, and from a trauma perspective, processing and understanding and integrating, as you say, trauma, we know that, retelling the story, as it happened is not therapeutic. That
Right.
can re-traumatize. You don't want to just, go right into it like that. And a really therapeutic way to kind of understand or make sense of it or be with the feelings or experience of trauma is through metaphor and storytelling.
Exactly.
So this is where something like, watching a horror movie and seeing a familiar feeling or experience, play out on the screen, whether you identify with the monster or whether you identify with the final girl, that can be very therapeutic. Or this is where things like dream work can even, come in and be really helpful for trauma, because you're exploring trauma through images and metaphor, and horror and dreams are very similar in that way. They're kind of, visual representations of our most powerful and salient emotions. So horror monsters and villains are doing us a great service, and we should thank them.
Absolutely. I mean, and what you're describing is one of my favorite ways to use tarot too. Because these images, whether it's, an archetype from a tarot card or a symbol just out in the world or a monster from a horror film, there's literal and metaphorical space between you and this image or this symbol, which creates an automatic sense of safety, which allows us then to reprocess or explore how these emotions or this trauma or these experiences have impacted us without, like you mentioned, re-traumatizing ourselves. So that's like really speaks to the power of archetypes and imagery and art and just horror too, just in general, these, scary, unspeakable things that are happening on a screen, but not happening to us. And we're allowed to practice regulating our nervous system and reminding ourselves that we're safe and experiencing the highs and then the baseline, the high or the lows, even, and then the baseline again, in a way that is contained and controlled.
Absolutely. And when it's in a controlled environment, there are things you can do to make it feel even safer, right? That you might not even realize you're doing to control your nervous system. You're eating popcorn because it feels comforting. You're pulling that blanket up closer. You're bonding with your co-viewer, whoever you're watching it with. You're maybe deciding to turn the lights on. You're screaming, you're laughing to release tension. And these are all really healthy ways to practice nervous system regulation, connect with, some tough feelings or shadow parts of yourself, and even stretch your window of tolerance.
Yes.
Like if there's something that is hard to navigate, hard to face head on, it's like you can look at it through a metaphor or storytelling in a horror movie and like stretch your window of tolerance to be with that even just a little bit in a safe way.
Yeah. And you're making me think too about the end, like of the movie, right? So you're talking about, the comfort, stretch, panic, that window of tolerance, and the experience that we get when we're watching this scary movie and we're either scared by what's happening or part of our shadow is being triggered. We get to experience like the finality, like the beginning, middle, and end, and then it's over. And we are back to our life. And we have seen that, like, okay, there's like a literal end here. When for a lot of us, when we're either experiencing something traumatic or we're, doing shadow work or exploring parts of ourselves that, are uncomfortable, it can be really difficult to feel like there's an actual ending. And that whole continuing the ambiguity of when will this end increases anxiety. So through film, being able to say, okay, in 2 hours, I know this is going to be over, or even having the ability to turn it off. I think it's a huge component that exists here in terms of regulating the nervous system and feeling in control of something that is potentially uncomfortable.
Well, do you ever notice how, like, sometimes if you're watching something that's really scary and, maybe your partner or, somebody's home and they're like, well, we'll just turn it off. Like, if you're scared, turn it off. And it's like, no, I can't turn it off. I need to see how it ends. Like,
I was just thinking that as I said it.
Yeah. Like, you need that conclusion to know, like, okay, it's like everything's going to be okay. And even if everything is not okay, you need some kind of ending.
That it's just finished.
Right. And like, that's actually why like nightmares can be so scary and traumatic, because you wake up at the scariest part. There's no ending. So like watching a horror movie all the way to the end, it gives you some sense of closure, unless it's like a friggin' 27-part franchise like Halloween or whatever with like 5 different iterations. It's like, okay, what's going on here? What happened to Josh Hartnett? That's all I want to know.
That's so funny.
Where did he go?
The way you talked about it, so it's so funny when I was like, yeah, or you could just like turn it off, and then you said, oh, but I don't want to. I was thinking the same thing. Like, I would never do that. Like, I would see it all the way through. And I was talking to you recently, like a couple weeks ago, about how I would never watch a home invasion movie again. And I was watching The Strangers for the first time. I think it was one of the, I know, it was like, I think the newer one. I forget which version it was, because I know there's a couple different ones. And the whole time, I mean, just like buried into like my partner's stomach. And they're like, we can turn it off. Are you sure you want to keep watching? I'm like, yes, I need to get through this. It just needs to finish. I can't like not see how it ends. But it was a big test in practicing my emotional regulation techniques, my diaphragmatic breathing, mantras. It really fucked me up.
But I was brain turned on during the movie. Yes. You're like, I'm practicing.
I'm safe and calm.
My polyvagal theory. Yes.
I'm in my head like, I am safe and calm. This isn't happening to me. And I'm like taking deep breaths. But yeah, she was like, we can turn it off. We can turn it off. I'm like, no, I'm going to see it through. And I did. I'm proud to say I watched it until the end, and I don't think I'll ever watch it again.
And you got through it together, right?
Yes.
You and her together.
We did. But yeah, it definitely fucked me up for a while. But it's really interesting, even that in that moment, I was thinking about you a lot. And especially too, because it's funny, I can watch like the Terrifier franchise and not be even remotely as activated as I was by The Strangers. And so I think that's a fascinating component too. So like when you're exploring, your shadow, or even just your emotional regulation or feelings and experience towards horror, finding how you respond to different types of horror can say a lot about kind of what's going on for you internally.
100%. It's so informed by your own experiences, by your own kind of, nervous system capacity. And like everybody, like it's a spectrum. Everybody has a different comfort level on the spectrum. So it's like, on the one side, it's your kind of lighter, and the other side, it's more extreme. And if I were to plot out like movies on my spectrum, it might look completely different than yours in terms of what you could tolerate. And everyone's is going to look so different. It's so individual.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, just based on what we're talking about, I'm always thinking about questions. So the first thing that comes to mind is, as we're watching these films, you might want to ask yourself, what am I seeing that might be reflecting parts of myself in this film? What parts of me exist in this movie, or what parts of me am I afraid of as I watch this? Because I think it can say a lot about just what we're experiencing or what we're ignoring.
Yeah, and it's like what parts of you are liberated right now?
Oh, that's a good one. I like that one, Candice. What parts of you are liberated right now? That was brilliant. Yes, that's a good one. Which, speaking of, you saying what parts of you are liberated earlier, you mentioned your monster soulmate. I really want you to start talking about that. Tell us what that is, how we can discover it. What does that mean? Give us all the details.
So your monster soulmate is a monster or horror villain who holds parts of your shadow that are unacceptable, that are hard for you to face or to look at kind of in your everyday life. But when you connect with this person on screen, they're sort of helping to perform that emotionally compensatory function. They're acting out things that you wish you could, but you are not. They're saying things that you wish you could, but you are not saying. And if you like, Shannon, we could do a little exercise to help you find your movie monster soulmate.
Of course, please.
So my movie monster soulmate, and I can't believe I'm saying this on a podcast that anybody anywhere could listen to, but I'm going to say it. Because what did I say before? There's no judgment when we're talking with the shadow.
No judgment.
My horror movie soulmate is Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. And this is very shocking for me to say out loud, because when I first saw American Psycho, I think I was like 13 or something. And this movie is very inappropriate for a 13-year-old girl. It's very gory. It's a satire, which sort of goes over your head at that age. I found it very scary. I found it disgusting. Patrick Bateman is very misogynistic. He's very violent. He's a serial killer. But when I revisited this movie when I was older, I sort of noticed like, oh, I'm kind of drawn to him. Like there's something here. And I kind of realized that he's my movie monster soulmate. So my conscious ego, right, sees him as like he's evil, he's selfish. But again, when we're dealing with the shadow, we can't have judgment. So if I kind of like set that aside, I'm like, okay, wait a second. The parts of me that are drawn to him are noticing he's charismatic, he's attractive. He's played by Christian Bale in his prime. He's hilarious. And he's passionate. Like he's passionate about murder and he's passionate about subverting corporate norms, but he's passionate, right? And I identify with that. And I admire these parts of him because, I realize they're shadow parts of myself, right? Like it doesn't necessarily feel good to own outright. Like, yeah, I'm vain. Right. I get mad at, sort of the corporate world and how everybody has to be the same. And like, here's this guy who is just so frustrated with the banality of everyday life and trying to fit in. And he just rages. Another part that I really identify with is like, Patrick Bateman is like maybe my animus, which is this idea that if I had an outward masculine expression that was also a shadow, maybe it would be him. And it's like that thing that Stephen King says about horror. It's like a place to lay down your fear for a few hours. Like for a few hours, I can just be Patrick Bateman. I can be ridiculous and vain and have an 87-step skincare routine and just sort of rage because it's not real. I'm just sort of letting my shadow play. And it actually feels very cathartic in that way.
This is so brilliant. And I want to do your exercise because I think it would be fun for folks to be able to do this too. But hearing you, I'm realizing too, just personally, without doing an exercise, I just want to say that mine is Wednesday Addams. And hearing like the way you talked about that character, I'm like, oh yeah, because for me, there's so much emotional detachment with Wednesday, and there's so much stoicism, and there's this, and of course, she's got this like deep fascination with the dark and the macabre and death and morbidity and strange things. And that's, definitely parts of myself that I'm unafraid to express, but she just gives no fucks. And there's also a part of her that is very unempathetic and just like does not bother herself with emotions or vulnerability. And I think watching her allows that part of me to like exist for a minute of like, oh yeah, like no emotional vulnerability, like stoicism, no nonconformity, the dark humor, and just not having to or feel the desire to take care of anybody except like yourself. I'm like, oh, fuck yeah.
And that's such like a cool shadow side, very real shadow side to appreciate of like a therapist too, right?
Oh,
it's like, sometimes it's like, you know what? I'm done talking about feelings. If I never see a feeling again, that would be great.
Yeah.
and Wednesday doesn't, of course she has them, but she really doesn't bother herself with trying to go overboard with it or take care of other people. So that's so healing and cathartic to be like, yeah, you know what, Wednesday, like, I don't give a fuck.
Right, exactly. So yeah, when you were talking, I'm like, oh yeah, for sure. And I've always been drawn to Wednesday, and also Lydia Dietz, but Lydia from Beetlejuice, but she is more empathetic and caring, but she's also kind of like Wednesday, super drawn to the dark and the macabre. But I would love for you to walk us through this exercise you developed that is also incorporates tarot and helps us use the cards to find our monster soulmate.
Yeah. So let's find your movie monster soulmate. So Shannon, what you're going to need right now, a piece of paper and a pen and your tarot deck. Yeah. That's really about it.
All right.
And anyone who's listening can do this too to find their soulmate.
Yes, follow along.
Yeah. So what I'd like you to do is, as best you can, tell yourself judgment to take a hike right now. Like, we don't know her. Go away.
Mm-hmm.
Send her away somewhere, a drink at the bar down the street. And without that judgment or constriction, write down 3 horror movie monsters or villains, any 3 in the whole wide world that you are feeling called to right now, that are top of mind to you, that are just feeling like, you know what, that person I'm really like relating to right now. They feel really good to me right now. Just write those 3 names down.
I'm an overachiever, so I wrote down 4.
No surprise.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was like, ooh, but I want to put them both down because I was like, I could stop at 3, but I'm going with whatever's in my head.
You got 4. What did we say? No judgment.
No judgment.
No judgment. Judgment shuts down curiosity. We don't like it.
Exactly. Okay. I didn't want to leave the 4th one out.
So you got your 3/4 monsters written down. And then what I'd like you to do is take your favorite tarot deck, whatever deck is calling to you right now, give her a good shuffle. And once she's all shuffled up, I want you to draw a card for each monster and sort of put that card face up in front of, the monster name or to represent each monster.
So and it's so funny. So I I'm I usually use my Tarot Vintage deck, but I am not. I've been obsessed with the Mind's Eye Tarot lately. I think US Games sent me this. And it's seriously so beautiful. So I'm using that today.
I love it.
It's very like mystical and kind of creepy in some ways. So I feel like it's fitting. All right. So I'm going to pull 4 cards. So the first one will be for Wednesday Addams. 6 of Cups. Okay. And then the second one I chose Samara from The Ring. So wait, am I supposed to tell you what I chose?
Yeah. This is great.
the sun. And then the third one is ghost face.
Love ghost face.
I know, right?
So
okay,
hot.
and that's the Knight of Wands. And then I'll do one more shuffle. The fourth one, I have not seen this movie since I was a teenager, but it popped into my head. And I was like, you know what? It just popped into my head. That's my fourth one. I'm going to put it on there. And it's Pinhead.
Interesting.
Hellraiser.
That movie is all about the shadow.
No, right? Eight of Wands. Oh, that's hilarious. Eight of Wands. Because I'm just like seeing like the wands on the pins. Okay. So I've got Six of Cups, the Sun, Knight of Wands, and Eight of Wands.
Okay. And so normally when I have people do this exercise, it's almost a bit of a journaling thing where I have, people write down what is coming up for you as it relates to each card and the horror villain that is assigned to each card, and sort of think about things about what does this reveal about you? What does it reveal or reflect about your shadow? What does this monster liberate inside of you? And so, Shannon, maybe if you'd like to humor us right now, you can sort of just give us your internal monologue about what's coming up for you with each card. And at the end of like this exercise about kind of going through each card, it's like whichever card is sort of pulling you in the most, that's the monster who's your soulmate.
Oh, okay. So interesting. I'm going to go, the one I really want to focus on, I think, because there's a lot here. So with Wednesday Addams, the Six of Cups definitely feels like family neediness. But Samara, and then, in Ghostface, the Knight of Wands obviously feels like kind of impulsive desire, really just going for what someone needs and wants. And then same with Pinhead with the Eight of Wands, this kind of not really thinking or feeling, because that whole movie is also about, if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of just desire and not being trapped and kind of really allowing yourself to explore that. But the one that I'm most drawn to right now is the Sun, because everyone knows I have a fraught relationship with the Sun archetype. So that's what I'm going to hold on to. And it's funny because that's what I pulled for Samara. And I was telling Candis before we even started recording, I was like, oh my God, right before we hopped on, I was thinking about Samara from The Ring. And so I think it's hilarious that I pulled the Sun, because it absolutely feels like this card that is entrenched with toxic positivity and the absolute opposite of rage. Because I think Samara from The Ring represents unresolved trauma, repressed rage, not being cared for, kind of being tossed aside and not really tried to be understood. And I think the toxic positivity that exists in the Sun card is very much, let's just put a pretty kind of like bow over it. Let's just shine the light. Let's only look at the positive. And so that's everything that's coming up for me with Samara and the Sun.
I love that. Yeah, the Sun is like this toxic positivity, like sunshine and rainbows, like get on your horse, you naked baby.
Right.
And Samara is just like, there's nothing sunshine and rainbows about her. She's like, I live at the bottom of a well.
Yes.
I'm wet. I'm sad. And I'm not going to let you forget it.
Oh, and actually you saying that, I live at the bottom of a well, I'm wet, I'm sad, I'm just like covered in gross stuff. When anger and pain and rage and trauma are buried like that, it festers and it gets to this point where it keeps growing and growing and growing until eventually it does just come out, which is what we see with Samara. And I think that's really fascinating, because then when it just comes out, it's not being released as in a healthy way. Like we were talking about the emotional compensatory function of horror, it often comes out as destructive and damaging. So I think pulling the Sun speaks to, hey, when we are ignoring things, we're trying to we're not shining a light. We can even say when we're not shining light on something, look what happens. So we could look at the sun, maybe not even as toxic positivity, but as we need to shine light on this stuff to give it space to be seen and be heard so that it doesn't control us. So there's a couple different ways to look at that. At first, I was looking at it kind of biased because of my relationship with the sun card. But then I realized, oh no, the sun is saying, hey, yeah, we do actually have to shine light on this. And we need to make sure that it is seen so it doesn't control us or impact our lives in a negative way.
Yeah, it's that thing where it's like if you don't tend to it, if you don't tend to the shadow or the trauma, it'll come out sideways. Or in Samara's case, it'll come out of a well and haunt you forever.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, by giving ourselves permission, whether through the exercise that you just walked us through or watching horror or trying to identify with some sort of, monster, we're consciously exploring and at least holding space for, if not, radically accepting, the parts of us that we deem or society deems unfavorable or undesirable. And then eventually helps it release its grasp on us. So,
and it's so interesting, like doing this exercise because, at first you were just like, yeah, it's Wednesday. That's my girl. And, of course you still relate to her. You still love her. But when you kind of did this little exercise, getting into a bit more of the shadow and noticing the sun coming up, like, ooh, I have a fraught relationship with this card. It's like pushing you a bit further. And I think that's what the shadow does. Like, it's not so obvious. It's not so easy. It's a bit tricky, stickier. And it sounds like this is one that you'll kind of have to like sit on and sort of like think about for a while. Like, what's going on here with Samara and the sun?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think this whole conversation really highlights that, these creatures or monsters or shadows or archetypes really hold valuable lessons about our inner world and our shadow.
Yeah. God bless them.
I love talking to you. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. But I just so appreciate you coming on here and sharing your brain and your creativity and your knowledge about therapy and horror and mental health. And I would love for you to share with everyone what you have going on, where people can find you, where they can get more of your goodness and maybe eat bits of your brain.
Yes, you can eat my brain at the following places. I have a podcast that you can find anywhere my bat signal reaches. It's called Mental Health is Horrifying, and I explore how mental health themes are portrayed in the world of horror. I'm also a psychotherapist like Shannon, and I provide therapy for final girls. I specialize in work around grief and trauma. I work with people one-on-one if you live in Ontario, Canada, which is where I live. And I also work with anybody, anywhere, through the Final Girls Club, which is my group offering. And it's a rotating series of workshops, courses, and kits. Right now, for spooky season, I'm running your Hallowed Halloween kit, which is a Halloween ritual kit that offers you the opportunity to tap into the magic of Halloween as a pathway back to yourself. This is all informed by depth psychology. There's exercises in there about tarot, about dream work, and of course, horror. Always horror.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.